March 7th, 1945. German engineers joked the Rhine was an uncrossable wall, confident that their last great barrier, Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, would vanish in a single blast. But as American armor stormed toward the river, something unthinkable happened. The charges meant to obliterate the span barely sputtered, leaving the bridge intact, and the path to Germany's heart exposed. Overnight, the impossible crossing became reality. How did the Germans' ironclad confidence unravel into catastrophe? And what split-second decisions let US troops rewrite the fate of the war? The real story behind the Remagen Bridge capture is far messier and far riskier than most people imagine. Here's what really happened when the Americans seized the uncrossable Rhine. The Rhine River cut across western Germany like a steel boundary, its wide, fast-moving waters forming the final natural defense before the heart of the Reich. For centuries, armies had viewed the Rhine as a dividing line between invader and homeland. By 1945, it was more than a river. It was the last hope for German commanders to slow the Allied advance. Every bridge across it carried enormous weight, but none more so than the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. Built during the First World War, the Ludendorff was a massive steel truss railway bridge, stretching over 325 meters from bank to bank. Its twin-track design and sturdy oak decking could handle the heaviest freight trains, tanks, and troop columns. The bridge's profile was unmistakable. Broad stone towers anchoring each end, latticed steelwork arching high above the swirling current, and a deck wide enough to allow both rail convoys and foot soldiers to cross at once. On the west, its tracks fed directly into Remagen, a key junction on the Cologne to Koblenz line. On the east, the rails ran toward Erpel, then linked with the main arteries to Frankfurt and deep into Germany's industrial heartland. For Allied planners, the bridge offered a rare, intact artery across the Rhine, one that could funnel entire divisions, tanks, and supplies into the German interior without the delays of pontoon bridging. Every other major span in the region had already been destroyed, or was being prepared for demolition. The Ludendorff, still standing, was a logistical prize. Its rail lines connected the front with depots and supply hubs, while its robust design could bear the pounding of heavy armor and endless columns of men. The terrain around Remagen only increased the bridge's value. Steep bluffs rose from the riverbanks, forcing attackers into narrow corridors. The river itself, swollen by spring melt, ran swift and deep, making any unassisted crossing perilous. The bridge was the only practical way to move large forces across with speed. For the Germans, holding or destroying it meant denying the Allies a direct route into the Ruhr, the industrial core that fueled their war machine. For the Americans, capturing it intact would erase the Rhine as a barrier. The fate of the bridge would decide who controlled the gateway to Germany's heart. German officers at Remagen faced a problem that no amount of training could solve. The bridge was supposed to be blown sky high, but the reality on the ground was nothing like the demolition manuals. The pre-war plan called for 2,800 kilograms of high explosives, enough to snap the Ludendorff's steel backbone in a single, thunderous blast. Instead, by March 7th, only about 300 kilograms of Donnerit, a mining explosive weaker than military TNT, sat in the bridge's most critical cavities. The rest of the charges were either missing, unplaced, or made up with sandbags and scrap to fake a fully loaded demolition. The shortfall wasn't just about supply lines. Hitler's strict orders demanded that no bridge be destroyed without written permission from high command. That meant every decision had to crawl up the chain of command and back down again, even as American tanks closed in. Major Hans Scheller, the officer responsible for the bridge, waited for the paperwork that would allow him to act. Captain Bracha, tasked with executing the demolition, scrambled to wire what little explosive he had, forced to improvise as the situation unraveled. Communications between the bridge and headquarters broke down under the pressure. Radio and telephone lines carried urgent requests for more explosives and for permission to detonate, but the answers arrived late, muddled, or not at all. By the time the final orders reached Remagen, American columns were already in sight. German engineers found themselves racing to finish their work in full view of the enemy, stringing cables and prepping charges as rifle fire echoed across the valley. The bridge's fate now hung on a patchwork of weak Donnerit charges and a tangle of wires, some already cut or sabotaged by forced laborers. Doctrine clashed with desperation. The demolition plan, carefully drawn up in quiet offices, was useless in the chaos of retreat and supply collapse. As the Americans approached, the Germans could only hope that what they'd managed to rig would be enough. The gap between plan and reality had never been wider. American armor thundered down the roads toward Remagen under the banner of Operation Lumberjack, pushing faster than even their own commanders had expected. The 9th Armored Division, battered but relentless, found itself at the tip of the spear. Orders were clear: reach the Rhine, cut off retreating German forces, and secure any bridge that still stood. Yet no one truly believed they would find the Ludendorff Bridge intact, not after weeks of scorched earth tactics by the retreating Wehrmacht. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, just 23 years old and leading A Company of the 27th Armored Infantry, rode at the front of the column. The roads were clogged with refugees, broken down vehicles, and the detritus of a collapsing army. Shells still landed in the distance, and the threat of ambush hung over every bend. Timmermann's orders from Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engemann were simple in theory: get to Remagen, seize the bridge if possible, and hold until reinforcements arrived. In practice, every kilometer brought new uncertainty. Reports filtered in. German troops were blowing bridges everywhere, leaving only twisted steel and stone behind. The expectation was clear. By the time the Americans reached the Rhine, the Ludendorff would be nothing but rubble. But as the lead elements crested the final rise above Remagen, the impossible came into view. The bridge's steel arches still spanned the river. Smoke wafted from the east bank, and German vehicles jammed the road, fleeing for safety. Timmermann understood at once what this meant. The Germans hadn't finished their demolition, or hadn't dared to try yet. Every second counted. He radioed back to Engemann and received the order: take the bridge if you can, but don't wait for the engineers. Timmermann faced a brutal calculation. Charging the bridge meant running straight into the teeth of German defenses, machine guns, snipers, and demolition teams ready to blow the span at any moment. Waiting for combat engineers to arrive with specialized gear would buy the Germans precious minutes to destroy the bridge. The clock was ticking. In the command half-track, Timmermann weighed his options. His men were tired, exposed, and unsure if the bridge was already wired to explode. But hesitation could mean losing the only surviving link across the Rhine. He called his squad leaders together, laying out the plan: move fast, keep low, and be ready for anything. The order was passed down the line. There would be no time for careful reconnaissance or elaborate tactics. The only hope was speed and surprise. As the first American infantrymen slipped out of their vehicles and began to fan out toward the bridge, Timmermann gave the signal. The assault would begin now, before the Germans could finish what they'd started. Sergeant Alexander Draubek crouched at the western end of the Ludendorff Bridge, heart pounding against the rattle of gunfire. The order came: move now. Without waiting for engineers or backup, Draubek surged forward, his boots slapping the planks as he zigzagged across the open span. Machine guns barked from the stone towers, bullets snapping overhead and splintering the wooden decking. Behind him, a handful of men from his squad darted out, spreading wide, rifles up, each step a gamble against the odds. Halfway across, a thunderous blast shook the bridge. Smoke billowed from the eastern approach as demolition charges fired, but the main span held firm. Chunks of masonry tumbled into the river, but the steel trusses stood. Draubek didn't slow. He ducked behind a steel girder, waving his men forward. Covering fire erupted from American positions on the west bank, pinning down German defenders and giving the assault team precious seconds. Drawbeck and his squad pressed on, weaving through tangled wiring and sandbags. They found demolition cables snaking along the deck, some still intact, others already cut or frayed. With quick hands, they slashed at the remaining wires, yanking them free and tossing them into the river below. One man kicked a smoldering charge off the walkway, sending it spinning into the current before it could ignite. Every move was urgent. The Germans on the far side scrambled to reload, but confusion and the shock of the failed demolition slowed their response. By now, more Americans were pouring onto the bridge, riflemen, scouts, and a few bold engineers. The assault teams fanned out, firing as they advanced, clearing out pockets of resistance in the stone towers and along the pedestrian walkways. Drawbeck reached the eastern end, breathless and exposed, and dove behind a pile of debris for cover. He looked up to see the first Americans spilling onto German soil, securing the far bank as German defenders began to fall back toward Erpel. Within minutes, the bridge was in American hands. Drawbeck's sprint had opened the way, but the crossing was far from secure. The battered span groaned under the weight of men and gunfire, its decking torn and its superstructure peppered with shrapnel. The east bank, now held by a thin line of Americans, braced for the inevitable counterattack. Behind them, the engineers prepared to race forward, knowing their work would decide if the bridge could hold against what was coming next. Shells began to land almost as soon as the bridge was in American hands. German artillery zeroed in from the surrounding hills, sending shrapnel through the battered steelwork and churning up the approaches. Within hours, engineers and infantry on the span found themselves the target of a relentless barrage. But the real danger came from above. Luftwaffe squadrons, desperate to destroy the crossing, launched wave after wave of sorties. Jet bombers, dive bombers, and fighter bombers, sometimes flying so low their engines rattled the rooftops of Remagen. In just 10 days, the Germans mounted an estimated 367 air attacks on the bridge and its approaches, throwing in their newest weapon, the Arado AR-234 jet bomber, in a final attempt to break the crossing. American anti-aircraft gunners responded with a wall of fire. Within days, an AA belt ringed the bridge, bristling with 40mm Bofors, .50 caliber machine guns, and searchlights. Gunners worked around the clock, tracking incoming aircraft, filling the sky with tracers and flak bursts. The Luftwaffe's attacks grew more desperate, but the concentrated anti-aircraft fire shredded many of the incoming planes before they could line up their runs. Pilots who made it through the flak often missed, dropping bombs into the river or the town beyond. Still, every raid threatened to undo the Americans' hard-won gains, and every lull brought only a brief respite before the next alarm sounded. The river itself turned hostile. German sappers floated mines downstream under cover of darkness, hoping the current would carry them into the bridge's piers. Combat swimmers, Klein Kampfverbände frogmen, slipped into the water, dragging explosive charges or piloting tiny one-man boats packed with explosives. Motorboats, loaded with charges, raced toward the span, only to be met by machine gun fire and searchlights. Some mines exploded harmlessly against the banks. Others were intercepted by patrols or detonated by sharpshooters before they reached their target. Even the sky became a source of dread. V-2 rockets, launched from hidden sites deep inside Germany, began to fall near Remagen. Their impact was unpredictable, often missing the bridge by hundreds of meters. But the psychological effect was real. Each shrieking arrival sent men scrambling for cover, even as the actual damage remained minimal. Through it all, engineers and gunners worked side by side, patching holes, replacing shattered timbers, and keeping the crossing open. Holding Remagen meant withstanding not just the enemy's guns, but every weapon the right could bring to bear, day and night, for 10 straight days. On March 17th, just after 3 in the afternoon, the Ludendorff Bridge finally gave way. 10 days of relentless bombardment, the weight of thousands of men and vehicles, and the scars of earlier demolition attempts had pushed the battered structure to its limit. Without warning, the central truss buckled and fell into the Rhine, dragging engineers and equipment with it. 28 American engineers lost their lives in the collapse, a stark reminder that victory often comes at a heavy price. The bridge's fall did not halt the Allied advance. By the time the steel skeleton slipped beneath the water, 5 full divisions had already crossed the Rhine at Remagen. Engineers had worked around the clock to erect treadway, pontoon, and Bailey bridges alongside the original span. These makeshift crossings kept the flow of men, tanks, and supplies moving east, ensuring that the loss of the Ludendorff was a blow only in memory, not momentum. The seizure and use of the bridge forced a reckoning among Germany's high command. Furious at the failure to destroy the crossing, Hitler ordered investigations and swift, brutal punishment. Major Hans Scheller, Captain Willy Brodtje, and several others were court-martialed and executed, scapegoated for what was, in truth, a collapse of doctrine and logistics under the pressure of defeat. Letters and diaries from the period reveal a climate of fear and confusion as officers weighed impossible orders against the reality on the ground. The crossing at Remagen sped up the Allied timetable by as much as 3 weeks. The rapid buildup across the Rhine fueled the encirclement of the Ruhr, choking off the industrial heart of Germany and hastening the end of the war in Europe. The engineers who kept the bridge open under fire, and those who perished in its final moments, are remembered not just for their technical skill, but for the resolve that carried the Allies past the last Great Barrier to victory. On March 17, 1945, at 1500 hours, the Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed after 10 days under relentless attack, but not before 5 U.S. divisions had crossed the Rhine, weeks ahead of Allied forecasts. Documents show German engineers had planned for 2,800 kilograms of explosives, but only about 300 kilograms of weaker donorite were actually placed, a shortfall that proved decisive. The bridge's capture accelerated the encirclement of the Ruhr and forced a crisis within the German command, leading to investigations and executions. Some wartime files on demolition procedures and German communications remain classified, leaving open questions about the final minutes before the failed blast. Historians agree, the rapid American advance, combined arms tactics, and field engineering overcame what was once considered an unbreakable barrier. Today, the Remagen crossing stands as evidence that even the most formidable obstacles can fall to speed, adaptability, and the unpredictable realities of war.